MoneyFM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. It's Ryan Emaad with you. The importance of mental wellness has gained ground in recent years as more companies adopt initiatives to keep their employees emotionally healthy. So today, we'll be tackling one issue at the heart of workplaces: loneliness. A topic that was covered in an opinion piece on the Straits Times. Emaad, do you typically view colleagues as friends in the workplace you've been through? How lonely do you feel at work or not?
I don't feel very lonely right now with you next to me. But no, in all seriousness, I guess in the past, we all have at some level experienced a bit of loneliness at work. And I think that is consistent for a number of us. You typically tend to buy into the culture of an organization that you join. So you always want to have that element of camaraderie amongst colleagues. Whether they're considered friends, I guess, is a topic for discussion
I imagine
as well.
a lot comes into the mix. You know, who your colleagues are, how old they are, whether you can connect with them, whether you're introvert or extrovert.
Introvert, extrovert, what time you come into work, what time you leave. And I guess in our industry, we've worked at, all sorts of people. But anyway, as they say, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. That famous line from William Shakespeare's King Henry IV would likely resonate with many corporate honchos.
Indeed, a common perception among many is that it can be cold and lonely at the top. But in fact, studies have found that workplace loneliness is likely to permeate through all the way to the bottom rung of the ladder.
Yep, and guess what? We're not so lonely in the studio today because joining us for this conversation is Audrey Quek, opinion editor at the Straits Times. A very good morning to you, Audrey.
Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. And also with us is Dr. Shawn Ee, who is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist and the director at the psychology practice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Very welcome. Audrey, let's start with you. Earlier on, Ryan and I briefly shared our experiences. Now we want to thrust you into the spotlight. We want to hear from you. How do you normally approach workplace friendships? And was there any point in your career that you felt lonely? And if so, why?
Okay, for me, I think it is important to have friends, right? Not the deep sort of friends, but at least social connections. Because we spend so much of our time in the office, and it would be terrible if everything is transactional and work-related. So for me, I think there are plenty of possibilities out there to make connections. Parents have a lot to talk about. Children, right? Pets. Ownership of cats and dogs also yield a lot of possible discussions. And football, guys get very animated, even if they disagree which is the best club in the world, right? So there are many areas where you can connect. And actually, if you're new to an organization, there are quite often telltale signs. Like, I think in the newsroom, there is one desk with full of plastic figurines of Batman.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And, and that was when I discovered that this colleague is a real fan of all things Batman. So this is where you can make connections, right? Have I ever felt lonely? Yes, it was during the early phase of the COVID lockdown. Because, coming to work, part of the joy is the buzz, the free-ranging conversations that you have with friends, and then there was this lockdown.
Yeah.
And I felt very cut off. It was a bit of a shock to the system. You miss all that spontaneity, and Zoom is not a substitute.
Yeah, the water cooler conversations, as they call them.
Yes, precisely. Or the pantry in our case.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shawn, I feel lonely sometimes because I'm not very good at small talk, so I can't really build connections as easily as some other folks. How will you tell if someone's lonely at work? What is going to be the factors you're looking at when you decide, this person is a bit more lonely and maybe a bit more introverted in a sense?
Thanks for that question. It's a huge question. I think it lends itself to, at least to some level, knowing someone a bit deeper to be able to know if they're truly lonely. But in general, to answer the question, I think, once we enter a new workplace or we've been there for some time, we would have some reputation, right? With some people knowing that we are such and such a person. So at some superficial level, we have to somehow apply our social skills, right? Appropriately, yes or no. And we also have our personalities that may clash with other people's values. So if we think about, at least on a superficial level, the social connection, as Audrey nicely put, if we came across as having a differing view, we might be seen as weird. Why is this person not talking? right? It might be, but that's just an impression. Even if that was the opinion or social opinion, that may not necessarily be true. That could be their work persona, but once they're out of work, they're like party animal.
Yeah, Shawn, this is a good point, right? Because I enjoy eating lunch by myself. So is it wrong to look lonely at least?
There's no lonely look, if you will. But I suppose if you want to, hunker down and have your own sort of like meal, there's nothing wrong with that. Even extroverted people might need time to come down from the overwhelm of having like a huge social event or, having to cope with too much steam. So just as much, you don't really know if someone is having a meal alone. You don't know whether they are lonely or actually they just want to have a quiet meal.
Audrey, Ryan just spoke about knowing someone deeper to know if they're truly lonely. How challenging is it to build such deep human connections? How do you open up to someone and feel comfortable enough to trust them with the information you're sharing?
I find that, honestly, it depends on the personality, right? And body language is one way you find out. But I also have to say there's this related problem of how deep you want to go, right? There is this separate issue of treating your office as a family. And you've heard of the term work spouse, right? So I think there is also a need for certain boundaries, how far you go with your friendships at work, and not to let your commitment and everything in the office go so far that it could come at the expense of your real family. So I would say it depends. You have to read the room, read the personality.
Sure.
Yeah, Shawn, that's a very good point, right? Where do you draw the line? Because to some extent, if you've got friends you look forward to seeing in the office every day, it's going to be quite enjoyable.
I think Audrey's point is well put. I think boundaries is the first thing we need to think about. I think boundaries in general, what it might mean for many of our listeners, is that it helps to keep in, it also helps to keep out. So if we think about what we might need to do in the office, we have to be a human. So what we tend to do is that we might repeat, and this is our deep psychological dynamics and repetitions. What that literally means is familial patterns. So let's say we were to think about office as a family or work spouse, we might then start to expect certain things from certain people in certain positions of responsibility and so on and so forth. So we know at a deeper level, psychologically speaking, when we come together as a group, we replay old patterns like schoolyard stuff. It's like going to school. I quarrel with my next door neighbor here because they got something better than me. Or, for example, another view here is that we regress deeply into childlike states, right, when we are in groups. And this is really interesting because psychologically speaking, no one really thinks about it that way. What, you mean I'm a kid? No, obviously not. But the way in which we ask for things, we expect things, tend to be pretty interesting then.
All right, if you're just joining us, we're in conversation with Audrey Quek, who's an opinion editor at the Straits Times, as well as Dr. Shawn Ee, who's a clinical psychologist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist and the director at the psychology practice. We're talking about loneliness at work. Dr. Shawn, are there any types of work or professions that might predispose one to loneliness, and why might be the case?
I would love to say that's like my top 3. Just by the number of professionals that come through our practice to be seen, you commonly see people from the finance sectors, lawyers are a big one, teachers, and so on and so forth. You have the whole upper rung as well as people, the usual you and me, and the stressors as well as the issues of loneliness per se exist everywhere.
Okay, so I guess this is something a lot of us can't run away from as well, a topic that we have to grapple with. This is where I think I want to bring you in, Audrey, to talk about bosses. It's quite a tricky balancing act. So in the Straits Times opinion piece, there's a mention that it seems that most subordinates do not enjoy spending time with their bosses much, let alone bonding with them. Why is there this dynamic? And I guess, is that the way it should be?
In that piece that we ran, what stood out for me were the name of 3 bosses who have admitted to being lonely. Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and Tim Cook. In the case of the first 2, I think given how volatile and intense they are, it would not be surprising that subordinates don't want to hang out with them because you never know what to expect. So bosses with that kind of temperament, I think it's natural you want to keep a distance. But that has the effect of them feeling very lonely at the top. But by and large, there are a lot of bosses who feel that they don't have friends simply because subordinates, especially in big organizations that you don't know the boss very well, you might find it socially awkward to hang out more with them simply because at the back of your mind, you might think, what if I made a gaffe? Like blurt out that says, I think people who like pineapples on their pizzas have poor taste. And then your boss happened to be one who loves pineapple on the pizza. Yeah. And also the fear of every time you have interaction, he's quietly assessing you at the back of their mind. So it's kind of a self-protective instinct. The other one is the other sort of dynamics, your reputation amongst your colleagues. You may like your boss a lot, think, your boss is the best boss you ever had, but overly friendly gestures and everything might be misread by other people in your team or in other parts of the workplace, that you are like brown-nosing, that you have ulterior motives, and that might give you a bad reputation, and that might affect your work with others. Yeah.
Shawn, where do you sit on this? Because like what Audrey pointed out, there is that fine line when you have this relationship with the boss, and then you have your dynamics, like you expect things from your boss and vice versa, which makes your work relationship a bit more complicated, because as a boss, you'll have second thoughts about scolding your subordinate if that's your friend.
I think something about boundaries and the personal versus the work stuff speaks loudly here. I think one of the biggest things that is hard to separate is the blurred boundaries between you being a colleague to someone or a superior to someone and having to still be kind as a friend to the person. A lot of people find that very hard to do, and it's a real issue there on a daily basis. But I do think that to be able to deal with some of these dynamics, we have to recognize what's being replayed here somewhat. And most people go to office don't think so much about this. They're like, I need to think about myself versus being evaluated, and also about, if I want to please my bosses all the time, then we might just end up being very upset all the time. So there are expectations on both ends, and this is part and parcel what I mentioned just now about the psychological dynamics that tends to come up quite a bit when people tend to do like subgroups, right? So these subgroups that some of us might be familiar with might be in groups and out groups. You are closer to the bosses, or you tend to, something else. And it also creates potentially quite a lot of scapegoating. So scapegoating is a huge term as well, and it comes up as a result of group dynamics. So I think some people in power, or some people who have been identified as being, that guy there at the corner, that tends to keep to themselves, we then tend to socially, isolate. Right, so these things might develop quite unconsciously and very implicitly because of the company culture, for example. And at the end of the day, start to eat away at certain people with certain expectations. And this might sound quite vague, but if we think about the earlier question you asked me, which is about, top 3 jobs and things like that, I think just clearly naming them like that is kind of unfair, because we know psychologically that these issues are a sign possibly of deeper personal issues, right? But also is about style. So deeper personal issues might be about, apart from work, in your other aspects of life, are you also lonely, right? These are valid questions to ask. So we shouldn't just judge people just because they eat alone, but we also need to be understanding in terms of, for example, hey, what have you been doing on the weekend? Nothing much, stay at home, watch some YouTube or whatever. That's okay too. But if you are truly a friend, a close friend to the person, then you might actually ask a bit more personal questions.
Sure.
Otherwise, you might just stick to the superficial.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, and thanks for
Cheers,
having
thank you
us.
very much.
All right, we've been speaking with Audrey Quek, who's the opinion editor at the Straits Times, as well as Dr. Shawn Ee, a clinical psychologist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist and the director at the Psychology practice. And we were talking about an issue that's at the heart of many workplaces, loneliness. Stay with MoneyFM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.